My name is Odette Chastain. I'm 38 years old. I'm a master perfumer running an independent fragrance house in Grasse, France. And last year, my own sister, who managed our business affairs, forged my signature on a licensing agreement selling 3 of my most personal formulas to a mass market beauty conglomerate for a fraction of their actual value, keeping the proceeds for herself through a shell consulting arrangement. I want to show you the exact moment a forensic document examiner in NICE confirmed the signature wasn't mine. But first you need to understand what it means to build a scent from nothing and what it feels like to smell it, mass-produced and cheapened on a stranger's wrist in an airport. Picture this, a notary's office in Nice, November 2025, an examiner sliding 2 versions of my signature side by side under magnification. One from a wine label I'd signed for a charity auction, one from a licensing document I had never seen in my life, the pressure and rhythm of the second one betraying itself the moment anyone actually looked closely. That's where this ends. Let me walk you through how we got there. If you're watching, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment. And I think anyone who has ever created something deeply personal will understand exactly what it costs to smell your own private grief turned into an airport gift shop bottle. I want to take you back further than most of these stories usually go, because I think you need to understand exactly what 11 years of training actually means before you can understand what it felt like to have 3 years of it sold out from under me. I began as an apprentice at 20 in a small, unglamorous workshop above a soap factory in Grasse, under a woman named Marguerite Fontaine, who had been composing fragrances since before I was born and who made every single apprentice she ever took on memorize 400 raw materials by scent alone before she permitted them to touch a blotter strip unsupervised. I remember failing that memorization test twice, standing in her workshop at 21, humiliated, certain she would tell me I didn't have the nose for this work at all. She didn't. She simply handed me a fresh set of vials and told me that talent without patience was worth nothing in this profession, and that she would rather train a patient nose than a gifted one that gave up. I spent 11 years under her guidance, learning not just the technical chemistry of perfumery, but something closer to a philosophy. That a truly great fragrance isn't built to please the widest possible audience, but to capture something specific enough that the people who understand it will never forget it, and the people who don't were never the audience it was built for in the first place. Marguerite died in 2015, and I opened my own small maison the following year. Funded by savings and a modest loan I structured deliberately small, because I wanted the business to grow only as fast as my own actual skill could sustain it, not faster. I built a reputation slowly through a handful of formulas sold in limited runs to collectors who understood what they were actually buying, not mass appeal, but specificity, a scent built to capture one particular memory, rather than to please the widest possible audience. My most successful early release, a fragrance called Marie Baz, built around the smell of the tide going out on the beach where I'd spent childhood summers with my grandmother, sold only 200 bottles a year, at a price that made grown men occasionally laugh out loud when they first heard it, and every single one of those 200 bottles went to someone who had written to me first, explaining why they wanted it. A ritual I insisted on precisely because I never wanted to build. Something meant to be sold to strangers who hadn't earned an explanation of what they were buying. My sister, Camille, 3 years older, joined the business in 2019 as our commercial and financial manager, handling contracts, distribution, and the parts of running a fragrance house that had nothing to do with the actual creation of scent. Work I was genuinely grateful to hand to someone I trusted completely, given how little natural instinct I had for that side of things myself. I remember the specific relief of that first year with Camille handling invoices and boutique relationships, finally able to spend entire days in the workshop without the low, constant hum of administrative anxiety I'd carried through my first 3 years running the maison alone. I want to be fair here because Camille was, for years, a genuinely capable manager, negotiating fair distribution deals with boutiques across Europe and protecting my creative time fiercely from the business demands that might otherwise have consumed it entirely. She turned away on my behalf at least a dozen licensing inquiries over those 5 years, always checking with me first, always respecting that certain formulas simply weren't for sale at any price, a boundary I never once had to explain to her twice. Our mother died in 2021, a slow decline that took the better part of 2 years. And during that period, I composed the formula that would eventually matter most to this entire story. I called it Sendra, built entirely around the specific memory of my grandmother's kitchen the winter she died, years earlier. When I was still a teenager, the smell of ash from a wood stove, dried lavender hung from the rafters, the particular mineral coldness of a stone floor in January. I never intended Sendra for commercial release at all. I built it purely for myself during my mother's final year, as a way of holding onto a grief that belonged to 2 generations of women in my family at once. When my mother finally passed, I remember sitting alone in my workshop, holding a blotter strip of Sendra, and feeling, for the first time in months, like I could actually locate the specific shape of what I'd lost. The binary choice moment came in 2024, when a major beauty conglomerate, having heard about Sendra through a journalist who'd profiled our maison and mentioned the formula in passing, approached us about licensing 3 of my formulas, including Sendra, for mass reformulation and production. I refused outright, explaining to Camille that Sendra in particular wasn't a product to me. It was closer to a private eulogy I happened to have made wearable, and that no licensing fee could compensate for what it would mean to smell a cheapened version of it on strangers in every airport duty-free shop in Europe. I remember Camille pushing back harder on this particular refusal than she ever had on any prior licensing inquiry, arguing that the conglomerate's offer, even at a modest per formula rate, represented more money than our entire maison typically earned in 3 years combined, and that grief, however real, wasn't necessarily incompatible with also being practical. I told her that some things weren't for sale regardless of the number attached, and I believed, at the time, that the conversation was closed. If you've ever had someone treat your most personal creative work as simply an underexploited asset, you understand exactly the disconnect I'm describing. Drop a comment if that's familiar. What I didn't know until much later was that Camille, facing pressure from a costly personal investment that had gone badly the previous year, a small vineyard property she'd purchased with her husband, hoping to convert it into a boutique hospitality venture, a project that had consumed considerably more capital than either of them anticipated and left them facing genuine financial strain, had continued negotiating with the conglomerate independently, ultimately producing a licensing agreement bearing what appeared to be my signature, authorizing the sale of all 3 formulas, including Sendra, for 2.1 million euros, a figure notably below what an honest, contested negotiation likely would have secured, structured to close quickly and quietly with a conglomerate eager to move before any competitor caught wind of the acquisition. I discovered this in October 2025, when a longtime client, a woman named Helene who had worn Sendra for 3 years, one of the rare handful of people I'd ever allowed to purchase it privately outside my own family, sent me a photograph from an airport in Frankfurt showing a mass-market bottle bearing a name close enough to Sendra's own, Sendra's, with an added final letter, close enough to be unmistakable to anyone who knew the original, with notes I recognized instantly as my own formula. Reformulated cheaply but recognizably, the ash and lavender still present but flattened, the mineral coldness replaced with something sweeter and more forgettable. The way mass reformulation almost always sacrifices exactly the specificity that made something worth copying in the first place. I remember standing in my own kitchen holding my phone, staring at that photograph, feeling something in my chest go very cold and very still. I called Helene immediately, and she described gently having actually purchased a bottle herself out of confused curiosity, and confirmed what I already suspected the moment I saw the label. It was Sendra, badly, cheaply, but unmistakably Sendra, sitting in a duty-free display case between celebrity fragrances and travel-size cosmetics, available to anyone with 40 euros, and no explanation required at all. If you've ever discovered that the most private piece of your creative work had been sold and mass-produced without your knowledge, you understand a very specific kind of violation. Tell me in the comments if you've experienced anything close to it. I confronted Camille directly before involving any attorney at all, still hoping, in that first raw hour, that some explanation existed that didn't require what I already suspected. Camille's face, when I showed her the photograph, told me everything before she said a single word. She didn't deny it immediately. She simply sat down at my kitchen table and put her head in her hands, and I understood, watching her, that whatever came next was going to be considerably worse than any accident or misunderstanding. I retained an attorney, Marceline Fournier, who requested the original licensing documentation from the conglomerate directly, confirming a signed agreement dated to a meeting 8 months earlier, a meeting I had no record of attending and could prove through my own studio's appointment calendar. I had actually spent that entire day engrossed working on an unrelated commission with 2 assistants who could confirm my presence. A commission for a private client whose own records, independently, corroborated exactly where I'd been that day. Marceline's forensic document examiner, a careful man named H.N. Roussel, compared the signature against 11 verified samples of my own signature, drawn from everything ranging from bank documents to the charity wine label Helene had happened to still have a photograph of on her own phone, and confirmed clear structural inconsistencies characteristic of forgery, the pressure variations, the hesitant connections between letters, the same telltale signs examiners always find when someone has studied a signature carefully rather than simply producing their own naturally. Marceline's further investigation, subpoenaing the conglomerate's own payment records once the litigation formally began, uncovered that the 2.1 million euro payment had been routed not to our business account at all, but to a consulting entity called Fontaine Advisory, registered to Camille personally, established just 4 months before the licensing agreement was signed, a name I recognized instantly and painfully. Since Fontaine had been our own mentor Marguerite's surname, a detail that felt, once I understood it, like an additional small cruelty layered on top of everything else. Using our teacher's name to disguise the theft of something that teacher had spent 11 years helping me learn to build honestly. We confronted Camille formally in November 2025, with Marceline present, in a conference room in Nice rather than either of our own homes, a deliberate choice on Marceline's advice, wanting the setting itself to signal that this conversation would be different from anything that had come before it. Camille's composure broke almost immediately once Marceline laid the documents on the table, the forged signature comparison, the appointment calendar proving my alibi, the payment trail to Fontaine Advisory. The vineyard investment was worse than I ever told you, she said, her voice unsteady, barely above a whisper. We put almost everything into it, and the renovation costs kept climbing past what we'd budgeted, and I told myself the formulas would eventually have been licensed anyway. That mass beauty conglomerates approach every successful independent house eventually, and that I was just moving the timeline forward by a few years rather than actually stealing anything that wouldn't have happened regardless. I convinced myself that once I'd stabilized our own finances, I'd explain everything to you and we'd split what remained fairly, like it had always been a joint decision from the start. It wasn't a full accounting, but it was the first honest sentence she'd offered since this began. I asked her why Sandra specifically, why she hadn't at least tried to exclude the one formula she knew meant more to me than any commercial consideration. The one formula I had explicitly and repeatedly told her was never for sale under any circumstance. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Marceline glanced at me, checking whether I wanted her to intervene. I shook my head. I wanted the answer myself, directly, without an attorney's mediation, softening whatever came next. I think some part of me resented how much of yourself you put into that 1 cent, Camille finally said, when the business side, the side I actually managed, the contracts and the boutique relationships and the invoicing that kept this entire maison functioning, never got that same reverence from either of us. You built Sandra out of Man's death, and I sat beside her hospital bed just as many hours as you did, and somehow the grief that became a formula was sacred, and the grief that became spreadsheets and distribution agreements was just logistics. I think I wanted just once for something I touched in this business to matter as much as something you touched. It wasn't an excuse, but it was, I think, the truest thing she said in that entire conversation, and it landed somewhere in me that the forgery itself, oddly, hadn't quite reached. Marceline negotiated a resolution with the conglomerate once the forensic findings were presented, and the conglomerate, facing the prospect of a public fraud claim that would have implicated their own licensing team's failure to verify a signature properly before wiring 2.1 million euros, agreed to void the fraudulent agreement entirely and recover the formulas, though the mass-produced bottles already in distribution required a separate, costly recall process. The conglomerate absorbed rather than risk further exposure. Camille forfeited her role in the business entirely and agreed to a structured restitution plan for the diverted funds, secured against whatever remained of the vineyard property once it was eventually sold. I discontinued Sendra entirely rather than ever release it commercially. Even in the small, careful, letter-requesting way I'd released Marie Bass. I kept the original formula in a single bottle in my own private collection, exactly where I'd always intended it to stay, and I destroyed every remaining trace of the reformulated version the conglomerate returned to me, unable to bring myself to keep even the evidence of what it had become in someone else's hands. I think some evenings mixing new formulas alone in my studio. About the sister who used to sit with me during my apprenticeship years, memorizing raw materials alongside me even though she had no interest in perfumery herself, simply to keep me company through the tedium of those long, exhausting evenings when I was 21 and certain Marguerite thought I had no talent at all. Camille used to quiz me on scent families from a note card she'd made herself, staying up as late as I did. And I think about that version of her often now, trying to understand how the same person capable of that quiet, patient generosity became capable of what she eventually did. I've come to believe both things were real. I don't think that makes either one smaller. Camille and I speak rarely now, brief, careful exchanges mostly limited to logistics around our late mother's remaining estate matters. I don't know what our relationship looks like 5 years from now. I know I've hired an independent compliance advisor to review any licensing inquiry going forward, someone with no family stake in any decision at all. A safeguard I wish, more than almost anything else, I had built into this business from its very first year. I think if you've made it this far, the thing worth remembering tonight is this. The most personal things you create are not commercial assets simply because someone else can find a buyer for them, and no amount of financial desperation, and no amount of old, unspoken resentment about whose grief was ever treated as sacred, justifies selling a piece of someone else's mourning to strangers in an airport. Some things are not for sale, and the people who love you are supposed to be the ones who understand that most completely, not the ones who eventually decide the price was simply too good to refuse. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs it. I'll see you in the next one.